How could just 6,100 fighting men withstand a 6-month onslaught from 48,000 Ottoman warriors backed by the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean? In the scorching summer of 1565, the tiny island of Malta became the stage for one of history's most improbable defensive victories, a battle that would determine whether Christian Europe would fall to Islamic conquest or hold the line against an empire that had conquered everything in its path for over a century. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who had crushed the Hungarians at Mohacs, who had stood at the gates of Vienna, who commanded an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Morocco, sent his greatest admiral and his most elite troops to wipe this stubborn Christian outpost from the map. What the Sultan didn't know was that the Knights of St. John, religious warriors who had already been driven from Rhodes 4 decades earlier, had spent those years preparing for exactly this moment. They had studied Ottoman siege tactics. They had transformed Malta's harbors into layered fortresses, and they had recruited a secret weapon that would turn the Mediterranean's hardest limestone into an instrument of survival itself. To understand why Malta mattered so desperately, you need to picture the Mediterranean in 1565 as a chessboard where the Ottoman Empire had been capturing pieces for generations. Sicily lay just 50 miles north of Malta, and beyond Sicily stretched the soft underbelly of Italy, Rome, and the heartland of Catholic Christendom. The Ottomans had already seized Constantinople in 1453, killing the last Roman emperor and extinguishing a 1,000-year empire in a siege that left 50,000 dead. They had taken Belgrade in 1521, slaughtering 40,000 defenders. At Mohacs in 1526, they had annihilated the Hungarian army, killing 15,000 knights and nobles, including the Hungarian king himself, effectively ending Hungarian independence for centuries. Rhodes had fallen to Suleiman in 1522 after a brutal 6-month siege that cost the Ottoman forces 50,000 casualties, but finally drove out the Knights of St. John, who were forced to wander the Mediterranean for 7 years before the Holy Roman Emperor granted them Malta in 1530. The Ottomans possessed the finest siege engineers in the world. Armies of fanatical janissaries who were taken as boys and raised to know nothing but warfare and loyalty to the Sultan, and a fleet of galleys that could strike anywhere along Europe's coastline with impunity. They had perfected the art of psychological warfare, often displaying the heads of defenders on pikes, impaling prisoners in sight of besieged cities, and offering populations the choice between conversion, slavery, or death. Malta itself was a barren rock, producing little food and less water, dependent on Sicily for grain and supplies. Its native population of just 20,000 scratched out a living from fishing and farming thin soil between limestone outcrops. The island's only real value was strategic. Whoever controlled Malta controlled the central Mediterranean, the shipping lanes between east and west, and the ability to raid the coastlines of Christian or Muslim powers alike. The knights who ruled Malta numbered fewer than 700 combat-capable brothers, supplemented by perhaps 8,500 local militia and Spanish soldiers, facing an empire that could field armies of 300,000 when needed. The crisis began not with trumpets and banners, but with intelligence reports filtering into Grand Master Jean de Valette's headquarters throughout late 1564 and early 1565. Ottoman shipyards in Constantinople were working through winter, an unusual sign suggesting massive preparations. Spies reported that Suleiman, now 71 years old and eager to complete his life's work of conquering the Mediterranean, had given the invasion orders personally. He appointed Mustafa Pasha, a 70-year-old veteran who had commanded successful sieges across the Balkans, as the land force commander, and paired him with the brilliant Admiral Piale Pasha, only 45 and hungry for glory. On May 18, 1565, lookouts on Malta's southern cliffs spotted the horizon darkening with sails. The Ottoman fleet consisted of 193 vessels carrying 48,000 men, including 6,500 elite janissaries, thousands of Sipahi cavalry, specialized siege engineers, miners, sappers, and tens of thousands of irregular troops. They brought 70 cannons, some capable of firing 160-pound stone balls that could pulverize medieval walls, along with mountains of gunpowder, tools for building siege works, and supplies for what they assumed would be a quick campaign. The Ottomans landed on the southern coast near Marsaxlok Bay, facing virtually no opposition, and began the long march north toward the primary fortifications around Grand Harbor. Grand Master de Valette, chapter 71 years old himself and a veteran of the Siege of Rhodes, who had spent 12 months as a galley slave after being captured by Ottomans in 1541, assembled his knights in the chapel and delivered a simple message. No relief was coming for months. Their supplies would last perhaps 4 months if strictly rationed, and they would win by making the Ottomans pay in blood for every foot of limestone. The first skirmish came on May 21st, when Ottoman scouts approached Fort St. Elmo, a star-shaped fortress guarding the entrance to Grand Harbor. A sortie of 100 knights and soldiers ambushed the scouts, killing 15 and sending the rest fleeing. But this minor victory only revealed the terrible mathematics of the siege. The Christians had wounded 6 of their own men, casualties they could not afford, while the Ottomans lost soldiers they could replace 10 times over. The knights had spent 35 years since arriving on Malta, doing something their Ottoman enemies never anticipated. They had become students of failure. After losing Rhodes despite fighting heroically, the Order's military engineers had studied what went wrong. They learned that high walls were actually vulnerabilities because they created large rubble ramps when destroyed by cannon fire, giving attackers an easy path upward. So Malta's new fortifications, designed by Italian engineers, were lower, thicker, and angled to deflect cannonballs rather than absorb them directly. They learned that castles could be starved out, so they built systems of granaries and cisterns to catch every drop of rainwater, storing enough to last 6 months even if the aqueducts were cut. They learned that mines and tunnels under walls had destroyed Rhodes's defenses. So they hired Maltese stonemasons who knew every geological layer of the island and trained them to countermine, listening for enemy digging and breaking through to collapse Ottoman tunnels or fill them with burning pitch. The knights recruited master smiths from Italy and Spain who produced arquebuses, the matchlock firearms that could penetrate Ottoman armor at 50 yards, and trained every brother and many militiamen in their use, creating a concentration of firepower unprecedented in fortress defense. They built a specialized fort, Sant'Angelo, on a peninsula jutting into Grand Harbor, surrounded on 3 sides by water, and accessible only by a narrow bridge they could demolish in minutes, making it virtually immune to assault, while providing a perfect position to fire down on any ships entering the harbor. When word reached Europe in early 1565 that the Ottomans were preparing an invasion, the Spanish Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo, sent a relief force of 600 additional soldiers and supplies in March, barely ahead of the Ottoman fleet. The knights studied how the Ottomans had taken Constantinople, where the defenders spread themselves too thin across 14 miles of walls, so de Valette made a ruthless decision. He would abandon the southern parts of Malta entirely, concentrate every fighter in the fortress complex around Grand Harbor, and force the Ottomans into a grinding battle of attrition where their numbers meant less than determination and defensive firepower. Previous Christian defeats had taught harsh lessons, and the knights had spent decades ensuring they wouldn't repeat those mistakes. Through late May and early June, the Ottomans probed the defenses, testing Fort St. Elmo with artillery bombardments and small assaults. On May 24th, Mustafa Pasha demanded St. Elmo's surrender, promising safe passage if they yielded, threatening impalement if they resisted. The fort's commander, a Frenchman named Broglia, responded by hanging an Ottoman prisoner from the walls. The Ottomans began systematic bombardment on May 27th, with 10 cannons firing from Mount Siberas across the harbor entrance. Each day, the guns roared for hours, smashing into St. Elmo's walls. But the fort's angled bastions deflected most shots, and the defenders packed the breaches with rubble and earth during the night. On June 2nd, the Ottomans launched their first major assault with 4,000 troops advancing behind wooden shields. The knights waited until the janissaries reached 30 yards, then opened fire with arquebuses and small cannons loaded with grape shot, shredding the front ranks and forcing a retreat that left 200 Ottoman bodies piled before the walls. The defenders lost only 14 men. Mustafa Pasha was stunned. He had estimated St. Elmo would fall in a week. But now it was clear this would take much longer. On June 7th, another assault with 5,000 troops gained a foothold on the outer ramparts. But a counterattack led by a Spanish knight named Juan de la Cerda drove them back after brutal hand-to-hand combat that killed 600 Ottomans and 60 Christians. Supply barges crossed Grand Harbor every night, bringing fresh soldiers to St. Elmo and evacuating the wounded, but each crossing risked Ottoman fire. By mid-June, the fort was a shattered ruin. Its walls collapsed in several places, its garrison reduced from 1,500 to perhaps 400 effective fighters, but still it held. The Ottomans were learning that taking Malta would require paying a price they hadn't imagined. The final assault on Fort St. Elmo came on June 23rd. Exactly 1 month after the Ottomans had predicted its quick fall, a delay that would prove catastrophic to their entire campaign. Mustafa Pasha committed 6,000 troops to a dawn attack following an all-night bombardment that exhausted and deafened the defenders. The janissaries came in waves, scrambling over rubble, fighting through breaches. And this time they kept coming, even as arquebuses and cannons tore gaps in their ranks. The defenders numbered just 120 knights and maybe 300 soldiers still capable of fighting, many wounded multiple times, all exhausted beyond human endurance. The battle raged for 5 hours of desperate, close-quarters savagery. The knights fought with swords, pikes, and clubs when their powder ran out, refusing to yield even as Ottoman troops poured over the walls from 3 directions simultaneously. The final stand took place in the fort's small chapel where 70 knights, too wounded to flee, propped themselves against the walls and sold their lives dearly, killing dozens more Ottomans before being overwhelmed. When silence finally descended, St. Elmo was a charnel house with 1,500 Christian bodies and perhaps 8,000 Ottoman casualties for a fort the size of a city block that Mustafa had promised would fall in days. Mustafa Pasha, surveying the carnage, reportedly said to his officers, "If the child has cost us so much, what price shall we pay for the father?" He ordered the bodies of dead knights decapitated, nailed to wooden crosses, and floated across Grand Harbor as a message of terror to the defenders of Birgu and Senglia, the main fortress towns. Grand Master de Valette responded by loading his cannons with the heads of Ottoman prisoners and firing them back, making it clear this would be a fight to extinction. The Ottomans had won Fort St. Elmo, but they had lost a full month of campaigning season and a sixth of their assault troops for a ruin they couldn't even use effectively. With St. Elmo finally captured, Mustafa Pasha turned his full attention to Birgu and Senglia in early July, bringing his heavy siege artillery to the heights overlooking the towns and beginning a systematic bombardment that would continue almost without pause for the next 2 months. The defenders now numbered about 4,600 capable fighters, 500 knights, 1,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers, and 3,000 Maltese militia, facing Ottoman forces that still numbered 40,000 despite the losses at St. Elmo. The geography offered both advantage and peril. Birgu and Sanglea occupied 2 fingers of land jutting into Grand Harbor, surrounded by water on 3 sides, but connected by narrow causeways that could be breached. De Valette had stretched a massive chain boom across the harbor mouth and positioned every available ship as floating gun platforms, creating a layered defense. On July 15th, the Ottomans launched coordinated assaults on both towns simultaneously. 8,000 troops attacked Sanglea from the landward side, while 80 Ottoman ships packed with soldiers attempted to force their way into the harbor from the seaward side. The land assault reached the walls after wading through a ditch the defenders had flooded with oily water, which they then ignited, turning the moat into a flaming barrier that incinerated hundreds of Ottomans trapped between fire and the pursuing janissaries behind them. The naval assault fared even worse when Maltese swimmers, recruited by De Valette specifically for this possibility, dove beneath the Ottoman ships and drilled holes in their hulls or cut their anchor cables, causing ships to drift into each other in the confined harbor where Christian cannons could target them at point-blank range. After 8 hours of continuous fighting, the Ottomans retreated, having lost 3,000 men against Christian losses of 250. The defenders had gained something more valuable than victory: proof that the Ottoman military machine could be beaten by tactics, terrain mastery, and willingness to turn every geographic feature into a weapon. But if you think one victory was enough to break the siege, you'd be catastrophically wrong. Mustafa Pasha was a veteran of 40 years of warfare, and he knew that fortresses fell not through glorious assaults, but through relentless pressure, attrition, starvation, and the grinding despair that came from watching your comrades die every single day with no hope of relief. Throughout late July and August, the Ottomans built massive siege works. Wooden towers taller than the fortress walls covered approaches that allowed miners to advance protected from arquebus fire, and artillery positions that could fire down into the towns from multiple angles. They brought their guns closer, sometimes within 100 yards of the walls, accepting casualties from Christian counter-battery fire in exchange for more destructive accuracy. On August 2nd, Ottoman miners successfully excavated a tunnel under Sanglea's walls, packed it with 250 pounds of gunpowder, and detonated it, blowing a 40-foot gap in the fortifications. Janissaries poured through, fighting their way into the town streets, reaching within 50 yards of the main square before a desperate counterattack led by a 67-year-old knight named Chevalier Robles, who had lost an eye at Rhodes and a leg in a sea battle years before, rallied 100 men in a berserker charge that drove the Ottomans back through the breach at the cost of Robles's life and 70 other defenders. The breach was sealed with rubble, timbers, and anything the defenders could pile into it, creating a makeshift wall that was weaker than the original, but held through sheer desperate determination. August 7th brought another massive assault. This time focused on Birgu, with 9,000 troops attacking in 3 waves. The first wave carried scaling ladders and reached the walls, fighting hand-to-hand on the ramparts for 2 hours before being pushed back. The second wave included janissaries, who established a foothold in a bastion Kanu called the Post of Castile, actually planting the Ottoman standard on the walls before knights and Spanish soldiers, led by a commander named Don Melchior de Robles, recaptured the position in fighting so intense that bodies were stacked 5 deep in some places. The third wave faltered when Grandmaster de Valette himself, 71 years old and wearing the full armor of a knight despite the blistering heat, appeared on the walls with sword in hand, rallying exhausted defenders who found fresh strength seeing their leader willing to die beside them. That assault cost the Ottomans 2,500 dead and wounded against 500 Christian casualties. But the defenders were now so depleted that even victories were bringing them closer to extinction. By late August, both sides were approaching breaking points. the Christian defenders were down to perhaps 3,000 effective fighters, many of them wounded multiple times. Food supplies were critically low despite strict rationing. Gunpowder was running out, forcing defenders to use crossbows and improvised weapons. Disease had killed hundreds, and the summer heat in metal armor was itself a deadly enemy. Yet the Ottomans were in worse condition than anyone in Birgu realized. Dysentery and fever had swept through their camps, killing thousands. Supplies from Constantinople had been raided by Christian corsairs, disrupting the logistics chain. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, were muttering about the staggering casualties for such limited gains. Most critically, the campaigning season was ending. Mediterranean galley fleets needed calm seas, and autumn storms made navigation suicidally dangerous after September. Mustafa Pasha knew he had perhaps one more chance to take Malta before he would have to admit defeat, sail home, and explain to Suleiman the Magnificent why he had failed to conquer a rock defended by a handful of stubborn Christians. He planned the final assault for August 23rd, throwing everything he had left at Birgu in a do-or-die attack. But then, on September 6th, lookouts in Birgu spotted something that seemed like a mirage. Sails on the horizon, coming from Sicily. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy who had been assembling a relief force for months, had finally gathered 8,000 soldiers and made the crossing. The Ottoman fleet, weakened by casualties and disease, was in no condition for a naval battle. Mustafa Pasha faced a choice: fight these fresh Spanish troops with his exhausted army, or cut his losses and retreat. The Ottomans began evacuating the island on September 8th, leaving behind their heavy siege guns, tons of supplies, and at least 25,000 dead. Of the 48,000 who had landed in May, perhaps 15,000 made it back to Constantinople, the rest dead from combat, disease, or starvation. The Christians had lost approximately 7,000 dead, including 250 knights, but they had achieved something unprecedented. They had defeated Suleiman the Magnificent's empire at the height of its power. The Great Siege of Malta didn't end Ottoman ambitions in the Mediterranean immediately, but it shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility and marked the beginning of a slow, centuries-long retreat that would eventually reduce the empire to a fraction of its former power. In 1566, just 1 year after Malta, Suleiman died during a campaign in Hungary, his dream of conquering Europe dying with him. His successors lacked his strategic vision and military brilliance, and without his driving force, the Ottoman expansion ground to a halt. In 1571, 6 years after Malta, a Christian coalition navy destroyed the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto, killing 30,000 Ottoman sailors and capturing or sinking 250 galleys. This was the largest naval battle since antiquity, and it would have been impossible without the breathing space Malta had provided for European powers to organize. Christian trade in the Mediterranean, which had been strangled for decades, began to recover as Ottoman sea power waned. The psychological impact was immeasurable. For generations, European Christians had lived in terror of Ottoman raids, with thousands of coastal inhabitants carried off into slavery every year from Italy, Spain, and the islands. After Malta and Lepanto, that terror diminished. Coastal populations began to rebuild, knowing the Ottoman threat, while still real, was no longer existential. The Knights of Malta, now heroes of Christendom, received enormous donations from grateful Catholic powers. They used the money to build Valletta, named after Grand Master Jean de Valette, a purpose-built fortress city designed to be impregnable. Its star-shaped bastions, angled walls, and interlocking fields of fire incorporated every lesson from the siege, and it was never successfully attacked. The order remained on Malta until Napoleon conquered the island in 1798, 233 years after their desperate defense had saved Europe. If the Knights had failed and Malta had fallen in 1565, the strategic consequences would have been catastrophic beyond measure. The Ottomans would have possessed a perfect base for striking Sicily, Naples, and Rome itself. The Papal States, already weak and divided, might have collapsed under sustained Ottoman pressure, fundamentally altering Christianity's political structure. Spain, already stretched thin defending a global empire, would have been forced to divert massive resources to defending its Italian territories, possibly preventing its colonization of the Americas from proceeding as historically occurred. The Italian Renaissance, which was still flourishing in 1565, might have been strangled in its cradle as artists, scholars, and merchants fled north ahead of Ottoman armies. The Protestant Reformation, then tearing Northern Europe apart, might have taken a different course if Catholics and Protestants had been forced to unite against an Islamic invasion of Italy and Germany. The entire balance of world power could have shifted eastward, with the Ottoman Empire rather than European powers dominating the age of exploration and global trade. The libraries of Venice, Florence, and Rome contained ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved through the Middle Ages. If those cities had fallen to forces that might have destroyed or scattered those collections, much of the classical knowledge that sparked the scientific revolution could have been lost. The price of failure would have been measured not in thousands of lives, but in the potential derailment of Western civilization's entire trajectory for centuries. And so who really deserves credit for this miracle victory? Grand Master Jean de Valette stands foremost, a leader who combined strategic vision with personal courage, who could design fortress layouts in the morning and fight on the walls in the afternoon, who inspired 6,000 men to hold against 40,000 through sheer force of example. But the Maltese themselves, so often overlooked in histories that focus on knights and nobles, deserve equal recognition. It was Maltese stonemasons who countermined the Ottoman tunnels using their intimate knowledge of the island's geology. Maltese swimmers who sabotaged Ottoman ships. Maltese women who carried rocks and boiled oil to the walls, who nursed the wounded, who operated the ovens that baked bread for the defenders. Without the Maltese population's total commitment to defense, no amount of knightly valor would have saved the island. The Spanish soldiers who reinforced the garrison, the Italian engineers who designed the fortifications, even the Ottoman deserters who provided intelligence about enemy plans, all contributed to a victory that was collective rather than individual. Perhaps most importantly, the victory belonged to institutional learning itself, to the knights' willingness to study their failures at Rhodes, adapt their tactics, and prepare methodically for decades against a threat they knew would eventually come. They won not through superior numbers or divine intervention, but through superior preparation, tactical innovation, and the recognition that defensive warfare is a science that can be studied, refined, and perfected. Today, more than 450 years later, the scars of the Great Siege are still visible across Malta's landscape. Fort St. Elmo has been rebuilt and now houses a war museum where you can walk through rooms where knights made their final stand. The walls of Birgu and Senglea still bear Ottoman cannonball impacts, physical reminders of a summer when every inch of limestone was contested. Valletta, the fortress city built after the siege, is now Malta's capital and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a living monument to what desperation and genius can create. The siege entered legend immediately, celebrated in paintings, poems, and histories across Europe as the moment when Christendom finally stood firm against Islamic expansion. In military academies from West Point to Sandhurst, the defense of Malta is still studied as a masterclass in how to conduct fortress defense against superior numbers. how to use terrain and preparation to offset enemy advantages, and how leadership and morale can compensate for material weakness. The Great Siege of Malta proved that history isn't determined by the size of armies, but by the courage of defenders, the wisdom of preparation, and the power of collective determination when survival itself is on the line. 6,000 men held against 40,000 and changed the world. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of history's most incredible defensive stands. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, please hit that like button and help us reach 1,000 likes in the next 24 hours. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we've got more incredible battles and underdog victories coming your way. Drop a comment below telling me what battle or historical event you want to see covered next. Should we explore Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held the pass? Or maybe the Siege of Constantinople from the defender's perspective? Or perhaps something more obscure that doesn't get enough attention in mainstream history? Your suggestions drive what we cover. So let me know what you're passionate about. I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next video, where we explore another moment when everything was on the line and the outcome seemed impossible.